Good morning to our Caron YouTube audience, and to those of you who are able to be with us in person this morning, and to those who are watching on the live stream from our older adult program and anywhere else around the campus. So grateful to be here and be the principal presider of the Caron Chapel service, and I've been in the role for a number of years, and I have a sequence of topics that rotates around, and this week happens to be topic number 1. So quite a foundational issue for me and for the chapel service in its entirety and history. The topic, one-word title for today is healing. And I want to take a fresh run at the topic. I used to approach the topic in a certain way, and I've been moved this week to prepare a fresh message on the subject of healing for the Caron Chapel audience. So what occurred to me was, I don't know if any of you watch any streaming services or anything, but not too long ago I finished 1883 on Paramount. It was an intense thing, and it depicts a group of people on the Oregon Trail in the 19th century. And one of the things when they get to these remote frontier, not quite towns, but encampments, is snake oil merchants. And that's like, you can't have the Wild West depicted without somebody standing out there selling some elixir that, will fix everything. And we all know when we see that in the Western, to laugh at it and joke and imagine it's ridiculous. And I think in some way that has contaminated, even for me, the notion of faith healing. I remember years and years ago, I was struggling with cancer, and I was significantly ill, and I had been trained as I went from atheist to pastor, and then I went from pastor to interfaith chaplain. And in my interfaith studies, I had made this incredible friend, a guy named Paul. And when I was sharing with Paul about my ongoing cancer diagnosis and treatment, Paul said to me he wanted me to consider going to see a faith healer. And my first reaction was like, oh, no way. And then I looked at my business card, and I thought, well, actually, it might mean, if you read my business card in a certain way, it sort of suggests I'm a faith healer. So I needed to put those two things together. And I have a couple thoughts about that, and I want to ask you to think with me along a chain of reasoning that will get us back to that subject. So I was scientifically trained and scientifically minded in my atheism. I used that as an argument against religious and spiritual traditions. And so what does science say about this place and what we do? Science tells us, the neuroscientists have located the phenomenon of addiction in a part of the brain that has to do with choice making and deliberation, the sort of decision-making apparatus which occurs in the front temporal lobe, especially for those of you who are right dominant on the left side. So in the left front, this is your, what often we think of as the intellect, the part of your brain that really makes decisions and decides between A and B. At least it contributes significantly to that. The actual decision-making process in the human being is somewhat still a little odd and mysterious, because you can use the front left lobe to do this whole pro and con, and then decide to do something that is, got more con than pro to it. So we're a little weird on this stuff. But people like Dr. Nora Volkow at the National Institute of Drug Abuse and others have done these brain studies to show that those who are here in this room who have the wristband, so they're identified as people with a substance use disorder, one of the things that they have is a disrupted choice mechanism. They're not able to use that decision-making apparatus in the same way as people who are not suffering from this illness. It's sort of a diagnostic clue. And what that means is that this is really important, because what it means is that the family members who sit now on this side of the room and the clients who sit largely on this side of the room, often it's funny because I can use the side, often the family members over here are thinking of the crew over here like, what is wrong with you? Why don't you stop doing this? And the crew on this side of the room, now understanding that there's a disrupted choice mechanism, have to pivot and think, well, if my loved one cannot choose to do something else, where does that leave me? So that's piece number one. Choice is undermined. The capacity to make healthy choices is undermined. And intellectually driven and well-reasoned choices. A second thing that has happened from a lot of research about people who suffer from use disorders, and that's the correct terminology today for addiction, is that there are preceding events in the life of the person or in the generational history of the person, right? So in other words, we talk about it as some degree inherited. And yet no one is really firmly locked down whether that's inheritance of generational trauma or just inheritance of some gene that predisposes people. Those could be quite the same. But what has happened is that there are these really important studies that notice that people who have the term in the big studies, adverse experiences meaning grief, trauma that is either incident-related or developmental and may locate itself in early childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, or adulthood. But when you have been beaten, battered, hurt, wounded, thrown off, you are much more predisposed to land at a place like Caron with a wristband. So one of my favorite theorists about the subject of addiction is a guy named Gabor Mate, an MD and researcher, and Gabor Mate talks about this as hungry ghosts. And that what happens is that our clients have these demons, these ghosts, these things that happen in their history that plague them as nightmares for the PTSD sufferer and flashbacks, and that may plague them as grief for the person who has suffered horrible loss, or may plague them in other ways. And I think of today, all these poor families and individuals who are coming out of the Ukraine, and what the consequences are going to be. Or those of us who are here, having survived years of a pandemic. And if that didn't rattle you, I'm really impressed. But it has rattled a ton of us. And it predisposes, I'll use the word rattled. The rattled person is more predisposed to seek behaviors and substances that often put them at higher risk for addiction. So it's that can lead to the disrupted choice mechanism. And one more thing in terms of like a kind of a foundational understanding of how people get here is that, let me step back one from psychology, which is the adverse childhood experiences, to anthropology, and this idea that what's at work, this is not complicated, it's sort of straightforward, and it's not new either, or survival mechanisms. All we're trying to do, all of us, on any given day, is make it through the day. And it took me a long time to understand that my parents did not wake up in the morning and think, gosh, how can we mess up Jack today? But I know they didn't, and that they were doing the very best that they could, and that each of us is doing the very best that we can. And sometimes we do way better than others. But the underlying insight that I'm trying to sort of focus on for this thinking about healing and addiction is that addiction is, in many ways, the result of our best attempts at surviving these adverse experiences. And that when we needed to get high or to get drunk to cope either in the moment or in the aftermath of these adverse wounds, our brain develops these habits and patterns which ultimately manifest in the inability to make other choices than that. So, and not everybody who has adverse experiences ends up with addiction, and not everybody who has survival, panic and fear ends up with wounds that ends up with addiction. But I do think it's fair to say, in my 14 years of being here and spending a lot of time with clients one-on-one and in groups, this is really coherent and cogent for my anecdotal experience. And it also has a lot of research and people who are practitioners that are research-oriented behind it. There is a lot of consensus that these are important elements of the presentation of people who are addicted. is that while other people get out of these raw and bad situations relatively unscathed, at least for long periods of time, the person who becomes addicted to alcohol, opioids, crystal meth, cocaine, crack, whatever it is, gambling, prostitutes, shopping, has what, and I think this is interesting, it's an interesting citation, I'll use Bill Wilson's, he was the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, instincts gone awry. So we were just trying to survive, and survive fearful situations, and here we are all of a sudden doing things that are so unhelpful. Maladaptive coping strategies is another way that people talk about it. And I don't know if that helps the families have any more compassion for the individuals, but it helps me have compassion for myself, because I'm a person in long-term recovery, and when I hear about this, I can connect the dots. I can connect the dots not only to my own sort of wounding and the stuff that made me scared and made me feel like, oh, when my oldest siblings were getting me high, and then people offered me other opportunities for addictive experiences. And why that spoke to me was fundamentally because of a sense of difficulty with choice, with safety, and with trust. And in the end, one of the really crucial frontiers at the moment for addiction theory is attachment and intimacy. And there are people who are writing about this illness and recognizing that one of its characteristics and one of its great challenges in terms of helping people find their way to a healthier place is that the people who suffer from this lack intimacy and relational skills. Sorry, but I won't look at them. This half of the room might be relationally compromised. Me too. And in some way, the families also participate in this. So there's a difficulty with doing relationship. So I know that's a lot. I know I'm teachy and all that stuff, but I really want to come back to the snake oil merchant. And I want to say that it's worth rethinking whether and to what degree faith and spirituality help these contemporary and very significant understandings of the phenomenon of addiction. So, let me start with the brain science piece. When people look at, and psychology is very much on board with this piece of spirituality, one of the things I think is fun and interesting for me as a practitioner of these wisdom traditions and a student of ancient traditions is that mental health professionals in psychology and psychiatry are all about mindfulness today, right? They're all about meditation, and you hear about it on the television, and I was watching Top Gun last night, and there was a wellness commercial with 20 seconds of silence, and what we know is that spiritual practices retrain the brain, that they will help the addict become less automatically linked between impulse and action. And so prayer and meditation have a place in the neuroscience. Another thing that we know, if you look at what spiritual life means to me, and I'll use the 12 steps which are up on the wall there as an example, but I don't mean by that it's only the 12 steps that constitute spiritual life, because shortly one of our Jewish clients is going to read something from the Jewish tradition, a healing prayer from the Jewish tradition. The Christian tradition in which I'm ordained has strong healing practices. Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, the Eastern traditions. This is a kind of a characteristic of wisdom traditions, is that they help the individual develop spiritually. And what that spiritual development looks like in the 12 steps is wound healing. So if you're not a student of the 12 steps and you don't know what I'm talking about, but you read the board there, in 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 is the middle work of the 12 steps. And in those 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, you have all of this repair that happens when people pursue that path in a significant way over a long period of time. And so you'll find people who have a testimony in the recovery movement of the 12 steps that will talk about how their lives have changed and they feel a new freedom and a new happiness, and they feel that they have a higher power at work in their lives, and they no longer regret the past nor wish to shut the door on it. I'm quoting directly from the literature with those phrases about the transformation that occurs. And there is a work of the follower of a spiritual tradition to repair their lives. And one of the other things that spiritual life involves is affiliation. It's the idea that I have belonging and I have a way that I say I follow, right? So if I'm a Buddhist, then I follow an eightfold path. Or if I'm a Jewish person, then the Torah provides me direction. Or, and in each of these senses, I have a community of belonging and a context of meaning that really informs and shapes the way I live my life. So, sorry, got myself thrown off. The work of recovery is one that is substantial and meaningful and real, and addresses what the spiritual work of recovery program addresses what the science and the theory tells us is wrong here. So by no means is it snake oil to suggest to people that they should adopt prayer and meditative practices, that they should do the spiritual work of a wisdom tradition, that they should also find themselves immersed in a spiritual way or a community where they find a sense of belonging. And what happens is that the fruit of this ultimately is a restored connectedness and an ability to stand for me as a person in front of you and think of myself as less compromised than I did most of my life. Less awkward, less fearful, more willing to risk truth and authenticity in relationship. And that, my friends, is the healing that makes this place so beloved by so many people, because this is a place where, in extraordinary number and in better percentage than in most other treatment environments that the insurance companies can measure, we're able to deliver our clients better near-term and I would argue longer-term outcomes of healing and restored lives. And people talk about this as Magic Mountain, and there is a magic here. People talk about this place because of the chapel service, and it's certainly because of moments like we just had with a client who sings from her heart in a way that captures all of us, because we think about the guts that takes for her to do that, and the passion and the meaning of the song, and how right on that song was for this message today, because it was about relationship and learning to feel love. But what I believe, and I'll finish here in a second, what I believe is that you don't end up here by accident. You end up here, whether on this side of the room or this side of the room, because you have been harmed by this destruction of our intimacy and by the erosion of someone in your life's capacity to make choice. And that you have this hope and this dream when you sit in these chairs that either you or your loved one will gain the capacity to make healthy choices back. And that will become a safe constituent in the network of your relationships. And I am here to tell you, I believe that is absolutely possible. The lying can stop, and the loneliness can diminish. Not that I think loneliness ever leaves the human person, because I think it's part of how we are like trapped in our individual beings, but yearn to be in community together. And this final, like, extraordinary ultimate sense of belonging that the religious person talks about in terms of their relationship with God, but the atheist can talk about in terms of their feeling of fit in their family or their community or the organismic natural environment in which they live. There is a transcendent wow that is ahead for people who are willing to submit themselves to the magic potion that we have on the table here. And it is no snake oil. It is the real deal. And you're going to hear a young woman celebrate a coin in a few minutes who I can tell you manifests for me like an example of how that is just I'm making a true commitment to you. That if you pursue this with your heart and with your, and I say this to the family as well as individuals, if you throw yourself in on this journey, the fruit that I'm talking about, which is transformed individual persons and restored relationships, and a sense of harmony is there for all of us. That's my hope and prayer for our healing today. Thanks.